Akwaba, welcome to this week's edition of Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian, writer, broadcaster, historian, entrepreneur, and podcaster. And in this week's episode of Ghana in Focus is special, commemorating 60 years after the overthrow of Ghana's first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And so that's the theme for this week's show, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the overthrow of Archival Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So before we start the show, if you like what you hear, please share with friends, your family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Focus on YouTube. Hit the notification bell, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, YouTube will notify you of that. Also, we're on Spotify. Look out for Ghana African Focus on Spotify. Hit the follow button, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast on Spotify, Spotify will notify you of that. All right, so please, like I said, share to your friends, family, and networks. All right, and if you would like to contribute financially to the show, we will welcome that to help us produce great content coming from Ghana and also from the African content. So you can contribute as little as $3 a month. You can do it as a one-off payment or as a monthly subscription. It's entirely up to you. I'll leave the link and how you can, donate to the show in the footnotes to the program. All right. Like I mentioned also last week, Expat Live Ghana will be hosting a major Regions Summit that will be taking place at the African Regent Hotel in Accra between April 1 and April 2. So if you are serious about wanting to relocate to Ghana, there'll be a lot of information for you to digest. So there'll be bankers, there'll be real estate developers, there'll be business owners, and there'll even be people from the government itself who'll be there to answer your questions. So if you want to register either in person or virtually, then I'll leave you the link again to the footnotes of the show, how you can register to the Ghana Relocation Summit taking place at the African Regent Hotel in Accra between April 1 and April 2. All right, so let's get into the show today. 60 years after the overthrow of the Archival Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So today, is the 60th anniversary of the overthrow of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president. So on February 24, 1966, Ghana, and for that matter, Africa, changed forever. A nation that had risen with confidence, purpose, and continental ambition suddenly found itself without the man who had shaped its destiny, Archival Kwame Nkrumah. And so today, 60 years later, we are not here to worship Nkrumah. However, we are here to understand why he was overthrown in that moment, and a moment that not just redirected Ghana's path, but reshaped Africa's future and still echoes throughout our politics, our economy, and our identity. So this is not just nostalgia about Nkrumah. This is a deep analysis. This is memory and accountability. So we're going to look at some, issues there which come into focus, come into play as to why and how Kwame Nkrumah was removed from power 60 years ago today. And so the first segment is that the Ghana Nkrumah was building. So between 1957 and 1966, when Ghana became the first African country south of the so-called Sahara to gain independence, because that's very important, because Ghana, or Gold Coast as it was known, was under British colonial rule for about 200 years. Before that, it was the Dutch, then the Danes and the Portuguese. So Ghana had quite a number of centuries under European colonial rule. And so on that day, on the 6th of March, 1957, Ghana got its independence. And Nkrumah said, at long last, the battle has ended, and that Ghana, your brother country, is free forever. So when Nkrumah said this, yeah, he meant business, because he went also on an industrialization drive, yeah? So that included building factories like, Tema Steel Company, Tema Rubber Company, Oboso Glass Factory, the jute factory in Kumasi for the cocoa bags. And it's a shame that today, Ghana is importing cocoa bags when we used to make them ourselves, yeah? So Nkrumah opened also a distillery factory whereby we can make our own beer, own alcoholic beverages, rather than import, like we are today, alcoholic beverages. Nkrumah also built the Gihok pharmaceutical ring, whereby Ghana was making its own medicines, yeah, not importing today, like we are, a lot of fake medicine from India and what have you, yeah. So Nkrumah set about industrialization in Ghana. Why? Because, Ghana under the British was basically a raw material based economy, yeah, whereby Ghana had things like gold and cocoa in its raw format, and the British were taking that raw material back to Britain and then using it as finished goods, and they're selling it back to Ghana and also the world. And so Nkrumah understood that a new country like Ghana needed rapid industrialization, yeah? And on that, Nkrumah said that, in terms of, industrialization, he said that we prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility. I repeat that again. On industrialization, Nkrumah said, we prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility. So this is why Nkrumah went on a rapid industrialization program. Yeah, and that was the cornerstone of a 7-year economic plan between 1962 and 1969. And obviously, as we are aware, Kwame Nkrumah was not allowed to finish that 7-year economic, plan. And so, apart from the industrialization drive that included building factories, Nkrumah also built state corporations like the Ghana Housing, like the State Housing Corporation, like the Cocoa, company, like the Tema Township, yeah, or the Tema Developmental Corporation, which was responsible for the upkeep of the Tema Township that Nkrumah had built, yeah. Also, that goes into Tema, Nkrumah built Tema from scratch. Tema was bush, yeah, and Nkrumah used the money that he had got being leader of government business between 1951 and 1957 to use that money to build a new city from scratch with modern facilities like, street lights, pavements, an industrial unit, shopping center, malls, underground drainage systems, etc. Tema, yeah, was a showcase of what Nkrumah wanted to envisage for Ghana as a country. And also, he used some of that money to build the world famous Akosombo Dam, which Nkrumah's vision included not only to supply electricity to Ghana, but also to the whole West African sub-region. And as you may recall, during Nkrumah's speech on the Independence Night of March 1967, Nkrumah said, and I quote, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked to the total liberation of the African continent." And so, in building the Akosombo Dam, the hydroelectric plant, yeah, Nkrumah was not just thinking about Ghana, he was also thinking about the West African region, how he could use the Akosombo Dam to supply electricity to the parts of West Africa. And so, during this period, was also between 1957 and 1966, Nkrumah also expanded education, because believe it or not, under British colonial rule, the British did not leave hardly any universities, any colleges of further higher education, or even schools, particularly in northern Ghana, because the British saw the northern part of Ghana as people who were just there to work and be servants, yeah? not to get educated, and not to be part of the nation building process of Ghana. And so, for the first time in Ghana's history, Nkrumah expanded education, not just in Accra and Kumasi, but the whole country, by building many, many schools, many, many colleges of further education, also built major universities and expanded on the Legon University. And also, he built many teacher training colleges. As part of his education expansion and nation building program, Kwame Nkrumah also invested a lot in science and technology. Yeah, that had at its cornerstone the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, because Nkrumah wanted to use Kumasi as a base to launch Ghana's scientific and technology prowess. And within that complex, yeah, that was showcased, as it does today, the scientific and technological advancement of many Ghanaian African students who, go to the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. And so science and technology was also in Nkrumah's forefront, because he knew that science and technology will play a major role in A, the country's industrialization program, and also B, importantly, in the nation building aspect of Ghana. And also, as part of this strategy, Kwame Nkrumah also built a lot of infrastructure. The one that comes to mind is the Great Accra-Tema Motorway that was built in 1961, 2 years before the UK's M1. That was built in 1963. Yeah, and that Tema Accra Motorway was built with concrete, not with asphalt, not with bitumen, but with concrete. Yeah, that was the innovative, way to build a motorway using concrete. Yeah, and that Tema Accra Motorway still stands today, and that was built with Ghanaian technology coming out of the Science and Technology School University in Kumasi, and also built by Ghanaian engineers. Yeah, so it shows you how far advanced and forward thinking Nkrumah was in terms of science and technology to build infrastructure that would last in a newly formed country. Again, during this time, 57 to 66, Kwame Nkrumah was instrumental in Pan-African leadership, taking the mantle from Marcus Mazai Garvey, who died in 1940. Kwame Nkrumah took the mantle of Pan-African leadership, having been inspired by Garvey to call for Africa to unite. And he was instrumental in forming the Organization of African Unity. And we all remember that famous speech that he gave on May 25th, 1963, at the formation of the OAU in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, where he called for other things, Africa to unite, called for a single currency, and also called for an African high command. Yeah? And that ties in nicely with also what Nkrumah was doing in terms of supporting, training, and funding liberation movements. You see, not a lot of people know this, right? But Nkrumah funded and, gave guidance to Patrice Lumumba in his struggle in DR Congo. Nkrumah also funded and supported, Sam Nujoma and the South West African, People's Organization, SWAPO, in Namibia. Yeah. He also, helped and trained the ANC, and particularly their military wing in Kunto Bisizwe, Spirit of the Nation. Nkrumah also trained and financed Frantz Fanon's Algerian FLN. Yeah. Nkrumah also financed and trained people like Dr. Amil Cabal of Guinea-Bissau. And so this gives credence to what Nkrumah said, that Ghana's independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa, which is why Nkrumah was fundamentally, at its fundamental base, supporting the various liberation movements on the African continent, which equated for his drive for African unity. So what Nkrumah shown between this time was that Ghana was a symbol of Black possibility. It showed you what can be done with great African leadership. And Nkrumah did that between 1957 and 1966. So Nkrumah, in this segment of the program, or the podcast, Nkrumah was not just building a country called Ghana, he was building a civilization, a Black African civilization capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Again, as Nkrumah said in the Independence Day speech, that we will show to the world that given the chance and the opportunity, we will show that the Black man is capable of managing his own affairs. And Kwame Nkrumah certainly did this between 1957 and 1966. Now, this is where things become to get a bit murky. So we look at the next segment, which is pressures and cracks, happened between 61 and 66. So because America and the West were keeping tabs on Nkrumah, even before Ghana became independent, particularly the US, were keeping tabs on Nkrumah because Nkrumah studied in the US and they followed his trajectory when he was in the US. You know, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Marcus Garvey, you know, great Africans from the Caribbean like C.L.R. James, like George Padmore, like Eric Williams and others. Nkrumah became, you know, a target of US government. And so the US was monitoring Nkrumah even before he became Ghana's president in March 57. And so when they saw Nkrumah's vision for Ghana and South Africa as a whole, they began to be jittery. And so what they did, what people know this again, Ghanaians even don't know this because history that will come on to later has been watered down to suit a certain narrative. But the British and the Americans sabotaged Ghana's economy 2 ways. Because 1, the price of Ghana's key commodities at the time, gold and cocoa, both of these commodities are priced by the West. Yeah. So what they did was deliberately sabotage the price of cocoa and the price of gold so that Nkrumah wouldn't get revenue to A, develop Ghana, but more importantly, B, support the liberation movements it was funding across the African continent. And so because of the sabotage of the economy, this then began to create economic strain as a result of not getting enough income, and also because of the rapid industrialization that Nkrumah was taking Ghana. This also, the sabotage of the economy by the white man, yeah, created internal opposition within the CPP, because you had people within the CPP asking themselves, was Nkrumah on the right trajectory? Not understanding that the white man was pulling the wires behind the screens, yeah, by sabotaging Ghana's economy. And also, there were opposition parties who were opposed to Nkrumah, particularly today's NPP, who back then were the UP, who before that were the United Gold Coast Convention, yeah, UGCC. But after independence, they regrouped to form themselves the UP, spearheaded by the likes of J.B. Dankwa and Kofi Abrefa-Busia. And by the way, J.B. Dankwa was paid by the CIA to, wreak havoc in Ghana. I mean, and there's 2, incidents that bear witness to this. So, again, people are not aware that there was many attempts on the life of Nkrumah. 2 come to mind. In 1962, in Kulungugu, Nkrumah was opening a factory in Kulungugu in very, very north Ghana. Yeah. And when he landed at the airport, he was welcomed by some officials and also a young girl who had a bouquet in her hand to give to Nkrumah. Unknowingly, that bouquet of flowers was a booby-trap bomb. And when the girl gave it to Nkrumah, the bomb exploded, killing the girl instantly and injuring Nkrumah. Nkrumah's bodyguard also got serious injury. And apparently, the shrapnel from the bomb that went into Nkrumah's body was responsible for the cancer that later killed him. Again, in 1964, at Nkrumah's official residence in Flagstaff House in Accra. A gunman opened fire, yeah, and Nkrumah's personal bodyguard, Salifu Dangati or Ugati, I think, but Salifu Ugati, a northerner, yeah, saved Nkrumah by taking the bullets. So this was Nkrumah's personal bodyguard who died as a result of taking the bullets that were meant to be for Nkrumah. So this is why, yeah, Kwame Nkrumah in 1964, because of his attempts in his life, orchestrated the Prevention Detention Act, yeah, and many people thought that was a dictatorship, but because of the effects in his life, Nkrumah had no option but to implement the Prevention Detective Act, yeah. Just like after 9/11, America, instituted the Terrorism Act in the aftermath of 9/11, yeah, to prevent any more terrorist attacks on American soil. Same way that Nkrumah did in 1964 to prevent any further, uprising. Nkrumah put in place the PDA to deter particular opposition parties who had been paid by the CIA and MI6 to derail Ghana and deal with Nkrumah. Yeah. And so, because of all this, Ghana was then becoming a battlefield internally, not because of guns, but because of ideology. The African ideology is anti the white man ideology. Yeah, the capitalism and progressive ideology is against African emancipation and liberation. And these are the two ideologies that came head to head in Ghana in those days. And this ideology is what led to the coup of 24 February 1966. Yeah. So Nkrumah, by that time, for an African president, had already established himself as a global statesperson. When Nkrumah spoke, particularly in the United Nations, people listened. And so Nkrumah became not just an African icon, but a global icon. And so Nkrumah was chosen by the United Nations to host a peace summit in Vietnam to stop the Vietnam War, because at that time, the Vietnam War was ongoing. Yeah. And so Nkrumah left Accra to go to Hanoi, now called Ho Chi Minh City, to attend these peace talks in Vietnam. Now, this is when those disgruntled police and military forces who were against Nkrumah seized power. And it seized power in a coup, a bloody coup that was organized by Western intelligence. I'm going to come on to that in a bit. Yeah. And so after the coup, the so-called National Liberation Council, NLC, takes over. And the NLC were basically puppets of the West. Yeah, and you can find this in documents in Britain, in America, and also in Ghana as well. And like I said, the coup of 60 years ago was organized, was funded, was hatched, and implemented by Western intelligence involvement, like Britain's MI6 and America's CIA. And they are declassified documents. So this is not just conjecture or anti-white sentiment, but this is actual fact, because they are declassified documents from the CIA that bear witness to the fact that it was they who masterminded the coup of 1966. Yeah? So, the coup of 50 years ago today was not simply a Ghanaian event. It was a Cold War event staged on African soil, because the West thought that Nkrumah was a socialist and hence a communist, and therefore would have more tendency towards Russia. And Nkrumah said that we are not friends with anyone. We are non-alignment, yeah? So, Nkrumah took support from everyone who would give it. For example, Nkrumah was talking about renewable energy long time ago, before it became a trendy, subject. So in 1962, Nkrumah built an atomic reactor outside Accra at a place called Kwabenya. And that atomic reactor was designed to give Ghana atomic energy that would power its industrialization and also power its growing population. Yeah, that's renewable energy. Yeah. So Nkrumah was thinking long ahead because he knew the population would grow and also he knew the industrial base would expand as well. So this is what Nkrumah was talking about. Yeah. So this is why the coup was not just a Ghanaian event, it was also, an ideological event that was staged on African soil because the white man did not want the black man to progress. And this is what's happened today in Burkina Faso with Ibn Traore. How many attempts have there been on Ibn Traore's life? About 30. And the man's only been in power since 2022. And why is Ibn Traore a target? Because he's doing what Nkrumah did, trying to A, industrialize Burkina Faso, and it's a call for unity among the African countries. Same as what Nkrumah was doing. And when a black man stands up for his own people, do not steal money like these other crooks like, Paul Biya, Cameroon, Obiang, Equatorial Guinea, Watawa, Cote d'Ivoire, Gisambare in Togo, Kagame in Rwanda. Yeah. When you steal money, you become a friend of the West. When you want to do for your people, when you want to liberate your people from the shackles of, white capitalism, white domination, yeah, then you become a target. And Nkrumah became a target from the West, by the West. This is why they use renegade forces within the Ghanaian military, within the Ghanaian police, to plan a coup to out Kwame Nkrumah. Yeah? And so, in the immediate aftermath of that coup 60 years ago, all the factories that Nkrumah had built to industrialize Ghana within the shortest possible time to meet the needs of the Ghanaian citizenry were either abandoned or sold off to private developers. So, the Tema Steel Factory, the Tema Rubber Factory, the Commander Sugar Factory, the jute factory in Kumasi, the shoe factory in Kumasi, the in Salom Cannery, all these factories, like I said, were either abandoned or sold by the neo-colonial National Liberation Council and also the UP, who were handed power in 1969 by the NLC, so-called National Liberation Council. Again, in the aftermath of the coup, state corporations were dismantled. So, for example, the State Housing Corporation and others were dismantled. Yeah. So Ghana shifted from a state-led development, whereby Ghana was using its own internally generated resources to develop the country, to now becoming a dependent on the IMF. So after the coup, these jokers in the so-called National Liberation Council got a loan from the IMF. And what did they do with it? Squandered it. Yeah. Again, in the aftermath of the coup, Pan-African projects were halted. So, as I mentioned before, Kwame Nkrumah was funding the ANC, was funding liberation movements in Mozambique, in Angola, in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, all in DR Congo, across the continent. All these projects were halted by the puppet pro-Western National Liberation Council. Again, many people are not aware of this. In the aftermath of the coup, all of Kwame Nkrumah's books were banned. His statues were removed, and this is where the legacy of Nkrumah began to be attacked by the anti-Nkrumahs and the neo-colonialists, yeah? And so, within this, period of the coup, Ghana did not just lose a leader. As a country, Ghana lost momentum because it took a backward drive to which the country has never, ever recovered. And so we move on to the next segment, right, which is the long-term impact of that coup on Ghana. So Ghana suffered a lot of instability. So there were coups in 72, 79, and 81. Yeah. So between 1966 and 1981, Ghana experienced about 4 coups. So that is hardly an environment in which to industrialize and develop one's country. And so because of this political instability, Ghana lost its industrial base. Yeah. And during this period of these coups, many Ghanaians left Ghana to go to Nigeria, to go to North America, and to go to Europe. Yeah. So because Ghana lost its industrial base, this is where Ghana began to depend on imports. So pre-1966, Ghana was a net exporter of food and other goods and services. Post-1966, until today, Ghana is now an import-led economy where we depend on imports for all our goods and services in our endeavor. Again, in terms of the effect on Ghana, the erosion of national confidence, to the extent that now many Ghanaians are not patriotic. They're not patriotic towards Ghana because, for example, there's a lot of stealing of state resources. There's a lot of, petty corruption by government officials and by the ordinary population because of this erosion of national pride, national confidence that came about as a result of the coup. So before the coup, Nkrumah instilled pride and a national conscience within Ghanaians to the fact that they would die, literally die, from over Ghana. But when Nkrumah was removed, that consciousness began to wane and die to the extent that now many Ghanaians today are not patriotic. They will sell themselves to the white man, to the Chinese, to the Arab for local shekels. Yeah. And also this period in the aftermath of the coup, the biggest impact on Ghana was the rewriting of history in schools. Yeah. To the extent that today, many school children don't know even about Nkrumah. Yeah. Let alone what he stood for, let alone his ideology. Yeah. And this is where the Danko Buzia sympathizers began to rewrite Nkrumah's history in the textbooks, saying that this man was a dictator, this man was a communist, this man did best for Ghana, blah, 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 blah. You get the picture? And so the coup created a Ghana that once took pride of itself to a country that now doubted itself. A Ghana that forgot it once led Africa. So now, the aftermath of the coup also had a long-term impact on Africa. So Pan-African unity weakened as a result of Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow. Yeah, because he was a champion of Pan-African unity. And at this juncture, I would urge you to buy Nkrumah's book called Africa Must Unite, because in that he documents, in detail why Africa must unite. Again, as I mentioned before, liberation movements lost a key supporter, key ally in Nkrumah. So like I said, Nkrumah funded Frantz Fanon in Algeria, financed, Sekuturi in Guinea-Conakry, financed Amicabal in Guinea-Bissau, financed Patrice Lumumba in Congo DRC, financed Zimbabwe, Mugabe, financed Sam Nujoma, Namibia, etc., etc. That all died when Nkrumah was overthrown. And because of this, Africa became more vulnerable to Cold War manipulation by the West and by other external forces who want to manipulate Africa for their own myopic and selfish needs. Yeah? And also the dream of United Africa delayed. And as you see now, the African Union is a toothless organization. Yeah? So Nkrumah's dream of the United States of Africa dissipated when Nkrumah fell. Yeah? And Africa as a continent hasn't really recovered also since Nkrumah's fall. Yeah? Because, for example, Nkrumah talked about Africa High Command. But those leaders back then didn't understand what Nkrumah meant by Africa Military High Command, the significance and importance of having that. Because had leaders took Nkrumah and went for African Military High Command, there'd be no mercenaries in Africa. Yeah, like you have, many white mercenaries, Russians, Americans, renegade forces in Africa trying to stabilize the continent. You wouldn't have the war in DR Congo. You wouldn't have the war in Somaliland with al-Shabaab and others. You wouldn't have the war in the Sudan that threatens to tear that country apart. Because Nkrumah understood this, and that Africa would be able to sort its own affairs with the Africa Military High Command to protect Africa from these wars and also from these, nefarious mercenaries. So essentially, when Nkrumah fell, Africa lost its loudest voice. So, when we evaluate Nkrumah 60 years on, his ideas and internationalization are correct. We see now with the example of Ibn Traore in Burkina Faso, how he also wants to use that template and is now industrializing Burkina Faso. So Nkrumah knew 60 years plus ago that Africa needed industrialization. And that's why he used Ghana as a model so that other African countries would follow. Yeah? Also, Nkrumah's warning about neocolonialism has proven correct. All these African puppets, like Kagame, like Obiang, like Gisembari in Togo, like, Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, like Ramaphosa in South Africa, like Paul Biya in Cameroon, like Alassane Ouattara in La Côte d'Ivoire. All these people are neo-colonialists, the puppets of the West. And Nkrumah warned about this in his classic book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. And Nkrumah has been vindicated because he understood that Western powers, if we didn't unite, would manipulate, illustrate our content, and what we see today with these, so-called leaders who are basically puppets of the West. So Nkrumah's Pan-African vision has been revived in part, basically, not through the after, but through the Sahel, with the union between Ibn Traore, Mali, and Niger. That is Nkrumah's Pan-African vision being revived, yeah? And also, a large part of Nkrumah's infrastructure that he built is still powering Ghana today, particularly Accra-Tema motorway, which is a key road network within Accra, so within the country, and also the Akosombo Dam, which to this day still gives electricity to Ghana and some other African countries. So history has a way of vindicating those who, like Nkrumah, were way, way ahead of their time. So after 60 years, with all that's happened since then, we now know that Nkrumah was right all along about industrialization, about African unity, and also about, neo-colonialists who would sell the content to the highest bidder. And so in closing, 60 years after that fateful day of February 24, we are left with a simple truth. Ghana did not fail Nkrumah. Ghana failed itself by abandoning its own ambition and sacrificing its ambition for the agenda of the white man. Yeah? However, the story is not far from over. As we see in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and to a degree Senegal, a new generation is rising, confident, connected, and unafraid to reclaim the African dream. And so, this ends this special edition of Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, journalist, historian, entrepreneur. If you like what you hear, please share with your friends, family, social media networks. And in next week's program, why Ghana or why Ghanaians are slaves in their own country, marking Independence Day. Next week will be Ghana's Independence Week, and so we'll be doing a special as to why Ghanaians are slaves in their own country. One not to be missed. And so for myself, Kwame, and from all the crew here on Ghana in Focus, is thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next edition of Ghana in Focus.